Hello and welcome to The Essential Reads. My name is Isaac and my goal is to bring to you a bunch of classic audiobooks in an easy and accessible way. We are continuing with Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is Part 1, Chapter 7. As on the previous occasion, the door opened the merest slit, and again, two sharp, suspicious eyes fastened him with their gaze out of the darkness. At that point, Raskolnikov lost his head and almost made a fatal blunder. Apprehensive lest the woman be alarmed at the fact that he were alone, and lacking confidence that the sight of him would put her at her ease, he grabbed hold of the door and pulled it towards him, so that the woman would not get the idea of locking herself in again. Aware of what he was doing, she did not jerk the door back towards herself, but did not let go of the lock either, with the result that he very nearly hauled her out onto the staircase along with the door. When he saw that she was standing in the doorway to block his entrance, he walked straight towards her. She jumped to one side in alarm, tried to say something, but could not seem to manage it, and stared at him, round-eyed. "Hello, Alyona Ivanovna," he began as familiarly as he could, though his voice would not obey him and kept breaking and trembling. "I've brought you something. But look, we'd better go over there, where it's light." And turning his back on her, without waiting for permission, he walked straight into the room. The old woman came running after him. She had found her tongue at last. "Good Lord, what do you want? Who are you? What's your business?" "For heaven's sake, Alyona Ivanovna, you know me. Raskolnikov. Look, I brought something to pawn. The thing I said I'd bring the other day." And he held out the pledge to her. The old woman glanced at it briefly, but immediately fastened her eyes on those of the uninvited guest. It was a nasty, attentive, suspicious look. About a minute passed. He even thought he could see in her eyes something akin to a mocking smile, as though she had already guessed everything. He felt that he was losing his head, that he was almost on the point of terror. Terror such that were she to have gone on looking at him like that without saying a word for another 30 seconds, he would have run away from her. "What are you staring at me like that for, as if you don't recognize me?" he said suddenly, with malicious spite. "If you want it, take it. And if not, I'll go to someone else. I haven't the time for this." He had not meant to say this. It had suddenly escaped from him, somehow of its own accord. The old woman came back to herself, her guest's resolute tone having evidently reassured her. "But why did you suddenly fly off the handle like that, dearie? What have you got there?" she asked, looking at the pledge. "A silver cigarette case. You know, the one I told you about last time." She stretched out her hand. "But why are you so pale? Look, your hands are shaking. Have you come out of a bath, dearie?" "It's fever," he replied abruptly. "One can't help looking pale. If one doesn't get anything to eat," he added, barely able to get the words out. His strength was failing him again, but the reply sounded convincing. The old woman took the pledge from him. "What is it?" she asked, looking Raskolnikov up and down with her fixed stare and weighing the pledge in her hand. "Something I want to pawn. A cigarette case. A silver one. Take a look." "Funny shaped thing. Doesn't feel like silver to me either. Wrapped it up well, haven't you?" As she attempted to untie the ribbon, she turned towards the window in search of more light. All of the windows in her apartment were closed in spite of the stifling heat. And for a few seconds she moved right away and stood with her back to him. He undid his coat and freed the axe from its loop. But he did not take it right out, merely held it in place with his right hand under the garment. His hands were horribly weak. With each moment that passed, he could feel them grow even more numb and wooden. He was scared he would lose his grip on the axe and drop it. Suddenly, his head started to go round.
Why on earth has he wrapped it up like this?
The old woman exclaimed in annoyance, and she moved a little way towards him. There was not another second to be lost. He took the axe right out, swung it up in both hands, barely conscious of what he was doing, and almost without effort, almost mechanically, brought the butt of it down on the old woman's head. But as soon as he brought the axe down, a new strength was born within him. The old woman was bareheaded, as always. Her scanty, light-coloured, greying hair, smeared thickly all over with oil as it always was, had been plaited into a rat's tail and gathered together under the remains of a horn comb which jutted out at the nape of her neck. The blow had landed smack on the crown of her head, something made easy by her smallness. She cried out, but very faintly, and suddenly sank in a heap to the floor, though even then she managed to raise both arms to her head. In one hand she was still holding the pledge. At that moment, with all his might, he landed another blow, and another, each time with the butt, and each time on the crown of her head. The blood gushed out as from an upturned glass, and her body collapsed backwards. He stepped back, allowed her to fall, and at once bent down over her face. She was dead. Her eyes were goggling out of her head as though they might burst from it, while her forehead and all the rest of her features were crumpled and distorted in a convulsive spasm. He put the axe on the floor beside the dead woman, and at once began to feel inside her pocket, trying not to get the welling blood on his hand. The same right pocket from which she had taken the keys the last time he had been there. He was in full possession of his faculties. He had no blackouts or dizziness now, but his hands were still shaking. Later, he remembered that he had actually been very careful and thorough, doing his utmost not to get any blood on himself. He took the keys out at once. As on the previous occasion, they were all in one bunch, all in a single steel ring. He ran at once into the bedroom with them. It was a very small room, which contained an enormous case full of icons. Against the second wall, there was a large bed, which looked extremely clean, with a quilted silk coverlet made up of patchwork. Against the third wall, there was a chest of drawers. Hardly had he heard their clinking than a convulsive shiver seemed to run through him. Once again, he felt suddenly like abandoning the whole undertaking and going away. But this only lasted for a moment. It was too late for him to go. He even smiled an ironic smile at himself. But then suddenly another, anxious thought hit him with the full force of a blow. The notion had suddenly occurred to him that the old woman might still be alive, and that she might yet regain consciousness. Abandoning the keys in the chest of drawers, he ran back to the body, grabbed hold of the axe, and swung it up yet again above the old woman, but did not bring it down. There could be no doubt that she was dead. Bending down and examining her again at close quarters, he saw quite clearly that her skull had been smashed, and was even dislocated slightly to one side. He moved as though to touch it with one finger, but then withdrew his hand quickly. He did not need to do that in order to see what was what. In the meantime, a whole puddle of blood had come welling out. Suddenly he noticed that there was a thin piece of cord around her neck. He tugged at it, but it was strong and did not break. It was, moreover, soaked in blood. He tried to pull it straight off her body, but something was holding it, preventing him from doing so. In his impatience, he again swung the axe up in order to bring it down and cut the cord right there and then on her body, but had not the courage to do it, and with difficulty, after 2 minutes of fiddling about, in the course of which he got blood on both of his hands and on the axe, he managed to sever the cord without touching the body with the axe, and pulled it out. He had not been mistaken. It was her purse. On the cord there were 2 crucifixes, one made of cypress and the other of copper, with, in addition, a small enamel icon. And right there, together with them, hung a small, grease-stained chamois leather purse, with a steel rim and ring. The The purse was filled very tightly. Without examining it, Raskolnikov stuffed it in his pocket, flung the crucifixes on the old woman's breast, and, grabbing the axe this time, rushed back into the bedroom. He was in a frantic hurry. He grabbed the keys and again began to fuss with them. But for some reason he met no success. None of them would fit in any of the locks. It was not that his hands were shaking all that badly now, but rather he kept making the wrong decision. For example, he would see that a key was the wrong one and would not fit, yet he would keep thrusting it in. Suddenly, doing some quick thinking, he remembered that this large key, the one with the serrated bit, which was dangling there along with all the smaller ones, could not possibly belong to the chest of drawers. The same thought had occurred to him on his previous visit, but must fit some small trunk or chest, and that possibly in everything lay hidden. He abandoned the chest of drawers and got down under the bed, since he was aware that in old women's dwellings, that is the place where such boxes are usually kept. So it was. He found a chest of considerable dimensions, nearly a yard in length with a bulging lid, upholstered in red morocco and inlaid with steel studs. The serrated key fitted perfectly and opened it. On top, under a white sheet, lay a hareskin coat covered with red packing material. Underneath it was a silk dress, then a shawl, and finally, underneath that, there seemed to be nothing but rags. The first thing he did was to start to rub his hands on the red silk packing material. It's red, so it won't show the blood so much, he found himself thinking, and then realized what he was about. Good God, am I going crazy or what? He thought in a fright. As soon as he moved the pile of rags, however, a gold watch slipped out from under the hareskin coat. He fell upon the things in a rush to turn them over. It really was so. Intermingled with the rags, there were objects made of gold, which were doubtless all the pledges, both redeemed and unredeemed. Bracelets, chains, earrings, hatpins, and the like. Some of them were in cases. Others had merely been wrapped in newspaper, but neatly and carefully, in double thickness, and tied round with cloth tape. Wasting no time, he began to stuff them into the pockets of his trousers and overcoat, without investigating or opening any of the parcels and cases. But he did not manage to take many. Suddenly, from the room where the old woman lay, came the sound of footsteps. He stopped what he was doing and went as still as a corpse. But all was quiet. He must have imagined it. Then, without warning, there was a barely audible cry, or a sound like someone uttering a quiet, abrupt moan, and then breaking off. There followed another dead silence, which lasted a minute or two. He sat squatting by the chest and waited, scarcely breathing. Then he leapt up, grabbed the axe, and ran from the bedroom. In the middle of the room stood Lizaveta, with a large bundle in her hands, staring in rigid horror at her murdered sister. Her face was as white as a handkerchief, and she was apparently unable to utter a sound. As she saw him run out, she began to quiver like a leaf with a mild shudder, and her features worked spasmodically. She raised one arm, began to open her mouth, but still could not get out a scream, and began slowly to back away from him into the corner, staring at him fixedly, but still without uttering a sound, as though she had not sufficient breath to do so. He rushed at her with the axe. Her lips grew contorted in the pitiful manner common to very young children when they begin to be afraid of something. Stare fixedly at the thing that is frightening them, and prepare to cry out loud. Moreover, this unhappy Lizaveta was so simple, downtrodden, and utterly intimidated, that she did not even raise her hands to protect herself, even though this would have been a most natural, life-saving gesture for her to make at that moment, as the axe was raised right above her face. She merely raised her unengaged left arm the tiniest distance, a long way from her face, and slowly extended it towards the axe, as though in an attempt to ward it off. The blow landed right on her skull, blade first, and instantly split open the whole upper part of her forehead, almost to the crown of her head. She fairly crashed to the floor. Raskolnikov began to lose his nerve completely. He seized hold of her bundle, threw it down again, and ran into the hallway. terror was gaining an increasing hold on him, particularly after this second, quite unpremeditated murder. He felt that he wanted to escape from this place as quickly as possible. And if at that moment he had been capable of seeing things in better proportion, and of making decisions, if he had been able to perceive all the difficulties of his situation in all its desperate, monstrous absurdity, and to realize just how many problems he would have to overcome, and how much villainy he might have to perform in order to get out of this place and arrive back at home again, he might very well have abandoned the whole undertaking and gone at once to give himself up. Not out of fear for himself, but from a simple feeling of horror and repulsion at what he had done. The sense of revulsion in particular kept rising up and growing inside him with each moment that passed. Not for anything in the world would he have gone back to the chest now, nor even to the rooms of the apartment. Little by little, however, he began to fall into a kind of absent-minded, even reflective condition. At some moments he seemed to forget himself, or rather forget what was important, and cling to trivial things instead. Even so, when he took a look in the kitchen and caught sight of a half-full pail of water on the bench, he hit upon the notion of giving his hands and the axe a good wash. His hands were covered in blood, and his fingers were stuck together. He lowered the axe straight into the water, blade first, grabbed a small piece of soap that was lying in a broken saucer on the windowsill, and began to wash his hands right there in the pail. When they were clean, he pulled out the axe, gave the iron part of it a thorough rinsing, and spent a long time, about 3 minutes, cleaning the wooden shaft on which a great deal of blood had gathered, using the soap to get rid of it. After that, he wiped everything down with some of the washing that was hanging up to dry on the clothesline that had been strung up across the kitchen, and then made a long and attentive examination of the axe over by the window. Not a vestige remained. The shaft was still damp. That was all. Carefully, he put the axe back into the loop inside his coat. Then, as far as the dim light of the kitchen would allow, he examined the coat, his trousers, and boots. On a first superficial glance, there appeared to be nothing to worry about. Only the boots showed some stains. He soaked his rag in the water and rubbed the boots down. He was, however, aware that he was not examining everything properly, that there might be something immediately obvious which he had not noticed. He stood in the middle of the room, reflecting. A dark, tormenting thought was rising up inside him. The thought that he was behaving like a madman, and that he was not at that moment in a position to either think properly or to protect himself. That what he was doing now was not at all what he ought to be doing. Oh my God. I must flee. Flee! He muttered to himself, and he rushed into the entrance hall. But here there awaited him a shock of horror the like of which he had never once yet experienced. He stood, looked, and was unable to believe his eyes. The door, the outer door which led from the hallway onto the staircase, the very same door at which he had rung earlier and through which he had walked, was open by a distance easily as wide as a man's hand. No lock, no bolt, for the whole time. For all this time. The old woman had not locked the door after him when he had come in, possibly out of caution. But for God's sake. After all, he had seen Lizaveta later on. How could he not have realized that she must have got in somehow? She hadn't come through the wall, had she? He flung himself at the door and fastened the bolt. No, that's not the right thing to do either. I must go. Go! He undid the bolt, opened the door, and began to listen on the stairs. He listened for a long time. Somewhere far away, down at the foot of the stairs, probably somewhere in the entranceway, 2 voices were shouting loudly and shrilly, arguing and exchanging abuse. What's up with them? At last, the hubbub stopped without any warning, as though cut short. They had gone their separate ways. He was on the point of making his exit, when suddenly a door opened with a noise on the floor below, and someone began to go downstairs, humming some tune or other. What a noise they're all making, was the thought that flashed across his mind. He closed the door again and waited. At last, all sounds had died away. There was not a soul about. He was just about to put his foot on the staircase when suddenly he heard more footsteps. Someone else's this time. The footsteps were very far away, right at the bottom of the stairs. But he later recalled very well and distinctly that right from the very first sound of them, he began to suspect that for some reason, whoever it was coming here, to the 4th floor, to the old woman's apartment. Why had that been? Was there anything particularly special or portentous about those sounds? The steps were heavy, regular, unhurried. There. Now he had passed the 1st floor. Now he was coming up further. There. Louder and louder. The heavy breathing of the man who had entered the building was now audible. Now he had started his climb to the 3rd floor. He was coming here. And he suddenly felt that he had gone stiff and numb. That this was like something in a dream. The sort of dream where one is being hunted down by pursuers who are close on one's heels and have the intention of killing. While one seems to have become rooted to the spot and is unable to move a limb. Then, as the visitor was beginning his ascent to the 4th floor, only then did he suddenly rouse himself and manage to slip back quickly and deftly out of the passage and into the apartment again, closing the door behind him. Then he gripped the bolt and quietly, soundlessly, slid it into its fastening. Some instinct helped him. When he had finished these preparations, he hid, scarcely breathing, right behind the door. The unbidden visitor was now also next to the door. They were standing opposite each other, just as earlier he and the old woman had stood when the door had separated them, and he listened. The visitor gasped heavily, several times, recovering his breath. He must be a big, stout fellow, Raskolnikov thought, as he clutched the axe in his hand. This really was all like a dream. The visitor grabbed at the bell pull and rang it loudly. No sooner had the tinny sound of the bell clanked out than he suddenly fancied there was movement in the room. For a few seconds he actually gave the matter some serious attention. The stranger, whoever he was, clanked the bell again, waited a little longer, and then suddenly, in impatience, began to tug at the door handle for all he was worth. Raskolnikov watched the tongue of the bolt leap in its fastening, and waited in dull terror for it to come flying out. That really did seem possible, so violent was the tugging. He thought of holding the bolt in place with one hand, but then reflected that he would guess what was happening. His head had started to go round again. "I'm going to fall," flashed across his mind. But the stranger began to speak, and he at once recovered his balance.
"What's wrong with them in there? Are they asleep or has somebody strangled them? The cursed wretches!"
He roared in a voice that seemed to come from a barrel.
"Hey, Alyona Ivanovna, you old witch! Lizaveta Ivanovna, my fabled beauty! Open up! The cursed wretches! Are they sleeping or what?"
And again, in a frenzy of rage, he pulled at the bell a dozen times in succession with all his strength. This must certainly be some intimate frequenter of the household who possessed authority over it. Just at that moment, light, hurried footsteps were heard somewhere on the stairs, not far away. Someone else was coming, too. Raskolnikov could not catch what they were saying at first.
"Is there really no one in?"
One of the men who had come upstairs shouted in a resonant, cheerful voice, addressing the original visitor, who was still continuing to pull at the bell. "Hello, Koch!" If his voice is anything to go by, he must be very young. Raskolnikov thought suddenly.
"The devil only knows what they're up to in there. I've practically smashed the lock to bits,"
Koch replied.
"May I inquire how you know my name?"
"I like that. Hey, I beat you at billiards 3 times in a row at the Grambenus the day before yesterday."
"Aha!"
So they're not in? Funny. It's damn silly, in fact. Where would an old woman like her be off to? I've got business with her.
I too, dear fellow. I too have business with her.
Well, what's to be done? Go back again, I suppose. Damn, and there I was thinking I'd get some money. The young man exclaimed.
That's right. There's no point in hanging around here. But why go and fix an appointment? She herself fixed an appointment with me. I mean, it's not exactly on my usual route. Where the devil can she have gone getting off to? That's what I don't understand. All year round she sticks at home mopping, the old witch. Tell you how her leg ache. And now suddenly she's gone off for a walk.
Couldn't we ask the yard keeper?
Ask him what?
Where she's gone and what time she'll be back?
Devil. Having to ask. I mean, she never goes anywhere.
And again he pulled at the bell handle.
Devil. Nothing to be done. Let's go.
Wait! The young man shouted suddenly. Look! Do you see the way the door catches when you pull it?
So?
That means it isn't locked, but only bolted. On the hook, in other words. Listen, can't you hear the bolt clinking?
So?
So what's your problem? It means that one of them's at home. If they'd both gone out, they'd have locked the door from the outside using the key, not bolted it from the inside. There, you hear the bolt clinking? For the bolt to be fastened inside like that, there would have to be somebody in there. They must be in there, but they're not opening up. Do you see what I mean?
Well, I never. Now that you come to mention it, I do.
Koch explained in astonishment.
Then what are they up to in there?
And he began to rattle the door violently. Wait! The young man shouted again. Don't do that! There's something fishy here. I mean, you've rung the bell, you've rattled the door, yet they don't open up. It means either they fainted, or...
What?
I'll tell you what. Let's go and find the yard keeper. Let him wrangle them out.
It's a deal.
They both started off down the stairs. Wait, you stay here, and I'll run and get the yard keeper.
Why do I have to stay?
Don't you think that one of us ought to?
I suppose so.
I mean, I'm studying to be a state investigator. There's obviously something fishy here. The young man heatedly exclaimed before rushing off down the stairs at full gallop. Koch stayed behind and gently moved the bell pull once again. The bell gave a single clang. Then quietly, as though he were musing and conducting an exploration, he began to move the door handle, pulling it out and drawing it downwards in order to convince himself again that it was secured by the bolts alone. Then, breathing heavily, he bent down and began to look through the keyhole. But the key had been inserted to it from the other side, and consequently, nothing was visible. Raskolnikov stood clutching the axe. He was in a kind of delirium. He had even been preparing to fight them when they came in. While they were knocking and discussing what they ought to do, he had several times had a sudden urge to get it all over with and shout to them from his side of the door. At times he had felt like cursing and taunting them until they forced the door open. Hurry up! Flashed across his mind.
The devil with it. What's keeping him?
Time passed. 1 minute, then another. No one came. Koch began to get restless.
To the devil with this!
He suddenly exclaimed, and in impatience, abandoning his vigil, set off down to the bottom as well. Hurrying along and making a noise with his boots on the stairs. His footsteps died away. Oh Lord, what shall I do? Raskolnikov undid the bolt, opened the door a little way, heard nothing, and suddenly, quite without thinking now, went outside, closed the door as tightly as he could, and rushed off downwards. He had gone 3 floors when there was a sudden, violent noise below. What was to become of him? There was nowhere to hide. He started to run back upward to the apartment again.
Hey! Damn it, you devil, stop!
With a yell, someone burst out of an apartment on the floor below, and, not so much as running as falling down the stairs, shouted at the top of his voice.
Mitka! 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 The juice you have to hide!
The shout ended on a high-pitched yelping note. These last sounds came from outside. Everything grew quiet. But at that same instant, several men, talking loudly and quickly, began to make their way upstairs with a good deal of noise. There were 3 or 4 of them. He had made out the young men's resonant voice. It's them. In complete despair, he went straight towards them. What must be, must be. If they stopped him, it would be all over. If they let him pass, it would be all over too. They would remember. They were now practically on top of one another. Between them, there was only one flight of stairs. And suddenly, salvation. Only a few steps away from him, to the right, was an empty apartment whose door stood wide open. The very same second-floor apartment that the workmen had been decorating, and which now, as if by special design, they had abandoned. They it must have been who had come rushing out with such a noise a moment ago. The floors had just been painted. In the middle of the room there were a small tub and a crock of paint with a paintbrush in it. In a single instant he had slipped through the open door and hid himself behind the wall, not before time. They were already on the landing. At that point they turned, passing him, and went on up towards the 4th floor, exchanging loud conversation with one another. He bided his time, then emerged on tiptoe and ran downstairs. There was no one on the staircase, nor anyone in the entrance either. He walked through it and turned left along the street. He knew abundantly well that at that very second they were already inside the apartment, that they had been much astonished to find it unlocked, when only just a short time ago it had been locked, that they were looking at the bodies, and that it would take them no more than a moment to put 2 and 2 together and figure out, beyond all question, that the murderer had just been there, and had managed to hide somewhere, to slip past them, to flee. They would also doubtless guess that he had been in the empty apartment as they were making their way upstairs. Yet meanwhile he did not dare on any account to quicken his step, even though there were still 100 yards to go before the first turning. Couldn't I just slip through some gateway and wait on the stairs of some building until it's all clear? No, that would be disastrous. Couldn't I throw the X somewhere? Couldn't I hire a cab? Disastrous. Disastrous. Here at last was the side street. He lurched along it, more dead than alive. Now he was halfway out of danger, and he knew it. He was under less suspicion. What was more, there were a great many people scurrying about, and he was obliterated among them like a grain of sand. But all the torments he had been through had drained him of so much energy that he was scarcely able to move. The sweat was rolling off him in drops. His neck was running with moisture.
Look at you, cut to the teeth!
Someone shouted to him when he came out onto the canal. He was in a bad state of diminished consciousness. The further he walked, the worse it became. He did remember, however, that as he came out onto the canal, he was suddenly afraid that there were not enough people about, and that he would become more conspicuous here, and nearly turned back into the side street again. In spite of the fact that he was almost at the point of collapse, he made a detour, and went back to his lodgings by a totally different route. Not fully conscious, he walked through the gateway of the building where he lived. At least, not until he had begun to climb the stairs did he remember about the axe. He had forgotten a certain vital task. He had to put it back, and in as inconspicuous a manner as possible. It went without saying that by this time he was no longer capable of realizing that possibly, by far, the best thing he could do was not to put the axe back in its old place at all, but to leave it by stealth, not now, but later on perhaps, in some part of another courtyard. But it all went off without a hitch. The door of the yard-keeper's room was set ajar, but not fixed with the lock, which meant that most probably the yard-keeper was at home. To such a degree had he lost his ability to think straight, however, that he went directly up to the yard-keeper's door and opened it. If the yard-keeper were to have asked him, "What do you want?" he would probably have simply handed him the axe. But the yard-keeper was once again absent, and he managed to put the axe back in its former place under the bench, even screening it with the log as before. No one, not a single soul did he meet after that on his way up to his room. The landlady's door was closed. Entering his quarters, he threw himself upon the sofa, without taking his coat off, just as he was. He did not sleep, but lay in a kind of oblivion. If anyone had come into the room, he would have leapt up instantly with a yell. The rags and tatters of vague thoughts swarmed in his head, but he could not seize hold of a single one of them, could not focus on a single one of them, even though he tried to force himself to. Thank you so very much for listening. If you enjoyed, please like, comment, share, all that jazz, and if you really enjoyed it, do subscribe because there is more to come. If you're listening on podcast, please leave a review. It helps get this in front of as many people as possible, and reading reviews really makes my day. If you want to support the show further on Spotify, please just, listen to it while you sleep. Show it to your friends and get them to listen to it in their sleep so that I can finally get monetized on Spotify, because they've opened that up to people living in Europe. That would be most very wonderful. If you want to support the show further, there's a Ko-Fi link now on screen. There's a link to that same thing in the description box. It really helps if you guys can support me in that way as well. But yeah, Raskolnikov has followed through on his crime. It took us 100 pages. I'm on a page like 104 now. But we finally finished part 1. And he's done it. He's committed his crime. So the rest of the book is just and punishment. So I'm very much so looking forward to that. And I hope that you are too. Once again, thank you very much for listening. And until next time, bye-bye.